The moment Earth Online officially began, a cold mechanical voice echoed across the world and announced, Earth Online has now started. Please choose your initial hero. Earth Online had descended upon Blue Star, and representatives from every nation would be allowed to select an initial life form to compete for supremacy across the planet. As long as the chosen species survived until the next version update, rewards would be distributed according to the extent of its dominance. Because of that, players from every country always focused on creatures with the most broken stats and powerful mechanics, hoping to stand out in this brutal game where countless civilizations fought for survival. But this time, I had no intention of following common sense. While everyone else chased overwhelming power, I directly chose a fool who ran around holding stones and jumping everywhere. The reason was simple. As a transmigrator, I quickly discovered that almost everyone in this world believed in creationism. Nobody knew that humanity had evolved over millions of years. That meant I possessed knowledge no one else had. With my complete understanding of evolution, I was determined to show them who the true ruler of nature really was. Just after arriving in this world, I looked at the results from the previous version. Back then, the undisputed rulers of the land had been gigantic divine beasts. Their absolute strength had crushed every competitor and allowed them to dominate the entire world. However, a massive meteorite eventually rose into the sky and changed everything. The once invincible dinosaur dynasty was completely wiped out. As I continued watching, a cold mechanical voice suddenly rang throughout heaven and earth. At the same time, a gigantic heavenly screen unfolded across the sky. No matter where anyone stood, all they had to do was look up to see it. Earth Online Comprehensive Update Announcement. First, the selection process for civilization observers from all nations has officially begun. The list of selected observers will be revealed in 3 minutes. Second, the timeline of the new version will advance to the prehistoric era. 4.4 million years ago. Third, the new version will introduce major adjustments. Biological species will become far more diverse. Detailed data will be released when the update officially launches. Fourth, the competition system has been fully upgraded. Rewards for winners will become more generous, while punishments for losers will become significantly harsher. There were only a few lines, yet the entire world instantly became tense. The most terrifying part was that this time they were only given 3 minutes. In every previous update, after the observers had been selected, there would always be a preparation period ranging from 3 to 10 days. During that time, countries would do everything possible to educate their civilization observers, analyze the situation, and formulate strategies. But this time, the system had caught everyone completely off guard. 3 minutes. Forget special training, even transporting someone to a research facility would take longer than that. At the exact same moment, my classroom fell silent. Every student stared at the heavenly screen, waiting for the name of Dragon Nation's new civilization observer. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the global announcement ended. A new line appeared on the screen. Dragon Nation Civilization Observer, Yang Chen. The next second, my photo appeared across the massive heavenly display. Instantly, the entire classroom exploded into chaos. Holy crap, Yang Chen? Seriously? One student shouted. Out of the entire country, how could it be him? Another person exclaimed, the previous Civilization Observer was from our school too, and now the new one is from here again. What kind of luck does this school have? Someone immediately sneered, luck my ass. The one who got picked is Yang Chen, the guy who sleeps through class every day. While everyone was freaking out, a system notification appeared before me. You have become Dragon Nation's new civilization observer. Earth Online will soon guide you into the game world. During this period, you will be unable to communicate with the outside world until the game settlement is complete. At that point, there was no room for refusal. Whether I liked it or not, I was going in. Meanwhile, in the imperial capital of Dragon Nation, the Earth Online Special Research Group had already descended into complete chaos. Almost everyone inside the base stopped what they were doing and stared at the 3-minute countdown with pale faces. What's going on? Only 3 minutes? One researcher cried out. There's no preparation period this time. Another person looked desperate. We're finished. What can we even do with this amount of time? The leader of the research group, Elder Chin, nearly blacked out on the spot. He was one of Dragon Nation's leading academic authorities and a core figure in the Earth Online project. Originally, he had been prepared to follow the usual procedure and personally guide the new observer. Instead, the system had completely destroyed the process. Left with no other choice, he gritted his teeth and ordered, "Investigate him! Within 3 minutes, I want every piece of information on Yang Chen placed in front of me." Very quickly, my complete file was delivered to Elder Chin. The good news was that I came from a prestigious university, and it just so happened to be the alma mater of the previous civilization observer. The school possessed a strong academic atmosphere and plenty of related knowledge. Even an average student should have had at least some foundation. But the bad news was that I wasn't an average student at all. I was famous throughout the class for being a complete underachiever. Sleeping during lessons and zoning out had become my daily routine. On top of that, I had fallen into depression after being dumped by my ex-girlfriend. In everyone's eyes, I was nothing more than a hopeless, love-struck loser who had completely given up on life. After reading this far, Elder Chin's face turned dark. He could only force out a bitter sentence as despair filled his heart. While the research team in Dragon Nation was already in chaos, the ordinary citizens weren't doing much better. The moment Earth Online's global livestream officially opened, audiences from every country gained the ability to communicate freely. Foreign chat channels quickly became a battlefield of bragging and mockery. Some people proudly claimed their nation's observer was a renowned zoologist. Others boasted that their representative was a member of a professional research team. As always, there were also those who mocked weaker countries and told them to surrender early. Yet the most explosive place wasn't the international channels at all. It was Dragon Nation's exclusive livestream. Only a few minutes after I had been selected, students from my own school had already started exposing my background. They revealed that I slept through classes, daydreamed constantly, and even managed to sleep during Earth Online-related courses. The moment that information spread, the entire nation felt a chill run down its spine. Not long ago, Dragon Nation had barely survived the devastating natural disasters caused by losing the previous version. Now the system had explicitly announced that punishments for failure would become even harsher. In other words, if Dragon Nation lost again, the disaster waiting for them could be far more terrifying than before. As a result, phrases like Yang Chen, top-tier underachiever, and Dragon Nation draws the worst possible card rapidly climbed the trending charts. Countless people flooded into the livestream and stared at the screen. There I was, calmly looking around at my surroundings with an unfamiliar expression, while the hearts of millions slowly sank. Of course, not everyone had given up hope. Some people argued that other countries had also been denied preparation time, meaning Dragon Nation still had a chance. Others insisted that this land had never lacked miracles and comebacks. Until the very last moment, nobody had the right to declare defeat. At that moment, however, I had already been transported by the system into a special virtual space. Hundreds of civilization observers had gathered there, and above every person floated the flag of their respective nation. The heavenly screen outside synchronized the broadcast in real time, allowing the entire world to watch everything happening inside. Before long, people naturally began forming groups. Nations with closer relationships and similar camps automatically gravitated toward one another. Around the observer from the beautiful nation, a large crowd quickly gathered, making him look especially imposing. On my side, several representatives also approached, but most of them came from the Middle East, Africa, and various smaller countries. Their numbers were noticeably fewer than the group across from us. Even before the version officially began, the existing international order had already silently revealed itself. However, the thing that truly energized everyone wasn't these small political dynamics. It was the new rule announced by the system shortly afterward. A mechanical voice echoed through the space. As civilization observers, you may intervene in the development of your observed species to a limited extent. Through such intervention, you may alter the species' historical trajectory and even its evolutionary direction. However, the number of interventions may not exceed 3, and the degree of intervention must remain within a restricted range. Additional note: when a civilization observer wishes to intervene, communication with external assistance may be established. The moment those words appeared, countless eyes lit up. In previous versions, civilization observers had been little more than spectators. They could watch species rise and fall but had no ability to influence their fate. This new rule changed everything. Migration patterns, physical structures, evolutionary tendencies, even these could now be influenced within certain limits. For powerful nations, this meant their research teams could finally participate directly in the game. For observers, victory was no longer determined purely by luck. It had become a contest of strategy and decision-making. Inside Dragon Nation's research headquarters, Elder Chin finally let out a breath of relief. He immediately ordered everyone to focus and prepare comprehensive data support for whenever I chose to intervene. Yet compared to many others, I could see the hidden danger much more clearly. At first glance, intervention seemed like an opportunity. In reality, it was an even bigger trap. Influencing evolution sounded simple, almost like allocating stat points in a game. But biological evolution had never been as straightforward as increasing strength or speed. Greater strength didn't necessarily mean better environmental adaptability. A larger body didn't guarantee longer survival. Throughout history, countless species that appeared overwhelmingly powerful had still been mercilessly eliminated by nature and the food chain. In other words, if I used these 3 interventions incorrectly, I could easily kill my species faster than if I had done nothing at all. Because of that, I silently repeated 2 words to myself: be cautious. Soon the version preview officially began. Although the system had stated that the new version would start at a timeline set 4.4 million years ago, the preview first returned to the ending of the previous version. Across the heavenly screen, a massive meteor crashed from the sky, replaying the apocalypse that had ended the Cretaceous period. The end of the world descended once more. The dinosaur empire vanished into history, Continental plates trembled violently, and the planet slowly restored order amid the ruins of catastrophe. After that, tens of millions of years passed in the blink of an eye as the heavenly screen accelerated through time. Following the disaster, the species that survived were mostly small mammals with strong adaptability. As the ages progressed, the global climate gradually warmed. Forests spread across the world, creating ideal conditions for a great expansion of life. Another 10 million years passed, and the climate slowly cooled again. Grasslands began expanding across the continents, triggering an explosive rise in mammalian diversity. Ancestors of pigs, cattle, sheep, horses, elephants, cats, saber-toothed predators, canines, primates, bats, and countless other species appeared one after another. Nearly 43 million years of evolution flashed by before everyone's eyes, yet the system treated it merely as a brief preview. None of it belonged to the actual version. It existed only to tell all observers one thing: the age of dinosaurs was over, and a new era belonging to mammals had completely begun. Then, the true new version finally arrived. The new Miocene epoch. For the first time, my expression visibly changed. If my memories from my previous life were correct, this was an incredibly important era that had begun roughly 23 million years ago and lasted for more than 20 million years. It was during this period that humanity's ancestors would gradually step onto the stage of history. But for most people watching both inside and outside the game, they still couldn't see that far ahead. They had no idea that the species they were about to choose would one day determine who would become the true ruler of Earth. What everyone noticed first were still the most straightforward and exciting creatures, the powerful ones. As the global climate cooled and vast forests were gradually replaced by grasslands, herbivorous mammals began expanding rapidly. The first group to capture everyone's attention was the elephant family. Then came the Deinotheres. These massive beasts stood over 5 meters long and weighed more than 12 tons. They looked somewhat similar to modern elephants, but their trunks were shorter, and their enormous tusks curved downward in a terrifying fashion. Soon after, other branches such as mastodons, Gomphotheres, and various elephant relatives appeared one after another. Although they differed in appearance, they all shared one defining characteristic: size. After living through 3 versions dominated by dinosaurs, most people still held a very simple belief: bigger meant stronger. Inside Dragon Nation's research group, Elder Chin immediately ordered the elephant family to be listed as a priority candidate. From the perspective of pure size and survival stability, they truly seemed like one of the safest bets in the new version. Next came the rhinoceros family. 2-horned rhinoceroses, black rhinoceroses, white rhinoceroses, and other relatives appeared one after another. Their bodies were enormous as well, but compared to the elephant family, they were still a level lower. Their speed wasn't particularly impressive either. Elder Chin's assessment was simple. They could serve as alternatives, but it would be difficult for them to reach the very top of the ecosystem. Then the timeline advanced to the grasslands 18 million years ago. Members of the horse family emerged. Evolving from ancient grassland horses, their bodies already looked remarkably similar to modern horses. They possessed strong limbs and exceptional running ability. Shortly afterward, deer species entered a period of explosive diversification. Antlered deer, ancient giraffes, giant giraffes, Sammotherium, true antlered deer, round antlered deer, strange antlered deer, Civotherium, and countless other species spread across the grasslands. They might not have possessed the most outrageous size, but they excelled in the qualities that mattered most for survival on open plains: speed, herd numbers, and environmental adaptability. If everything shown so far still reinforced the old belief that giant beasts were the strongest, then what appeared next completely shattered that simplistic idea. The saber-toothed cats had arrived. A short-sword saber-toothed tiger stood around 1.2 meters tall, with a body length exceeding 3 meters and a weight more than twice that of a modern male lion. Its limbs were long, its muscles dense and powerful. But the most eye-catching feature was the pair of deadly saber-like fangs protruding from its mouth. More importantly, the heavenly screen directly displayed scenes of it hunting massive elephant-like creatures. Speed, strength, killing efficiency. Every stat seemed maxed out. The sight sent shockwaves through countless viewers. It proved that the highest position in the ecosystem didn't necessarily belong to the largest herbivorous giants. It could just as easily belong to apex predators capable of consistently hunting massive prey. And the saber-toothed cats weren't just a single species. One branch after another appeared: false saber-toothed cats, winged saber-toothed cats, giant saber-toothed tigers, blade-toothed tigers, terror cats, and more. Every one of them radiated the aura of a supreme hunter. Even Elder Chin's expression finally became truly serious. In his opinion, the saber-toothed cats might be closer to the correct answer for this version than the elephant family. However, the heavenly screen clearly wasn't satisfied with presenting only one path to victory. Bears appeared next. At this point, their ancestors were only about a meter long and mostly lived in forests, feeding on plants, insects, and small mammals. They weren't particularly impressive yet. Then came the giant hunting dogs. Their bodies were several times larger than modern hunting dogs, and they possessed the ability to bring down large mammals. After that appeared Purosaurus, the giant crocodilian of the waterways. It stretched over 11 meters long, weighed more than 6 tons, and possessed one of the most terrifying bite forces among all land-associated animals. Then there was the enormous Wanambi snake, whose combat potential looked absurdly exaggerated, followed by the Argentine giant eagle, whose wingspan resembled that of a small aircraft. But when the scene shifted into the ocean, something truly monstrous stole everyone's breath away: the megalodon. Over 20 meters long and weighing more than 90 tons, this creature's open jaws alone could reach an astonishing 3-meter diameter. After dinosaurs disappeared from the land, giant beasts hadn't vanished at all. They had simply descended into the oceans and continued ruling another world. Its colossal size, horrifying bite force, and status as an apex predator instantly attracted the attention of countless nations. In the eyes of many observers, it looked like the direct successor to the marine rulers of the dinosaur age. One promising candidate after another was placed on the table: the elephant family, the saber-toothed cats, the giant hunting dogs, Purosaurus, Megalodon. Every single one looked ridiculously powerful. Every single one seemed worthy of a gamble. Yet just as most people's attention became completely absorbed by these colossal monsters and top-tier predators, the heavenly screen suddenly accelerated once again. Time leaped forward to 5.8 million years ago. The scenery shifted away from endless grasslands and deep-sea titans, moving instead toward a sparse woodland at the edge of the plains. There, among the trees, a small group of primitive apes cautiously lived their lives. They could stand upright for brief periods, but most of the time they still relied on their arms to swing and climb through branches. They were timid creatures. The slightest disturbance would frighten them. Their diet consisted mainly of fruit. In terms of strength, size, and speed, they were insignificant compared to the powerful species shown earlier. They looked so weak that it was almost pitiful. Then the heavenly screen revealed their name: Ardipithecus ancestors. They were so fragile that they didn't even dare fully step onto the ground. The timeline continued racing forward. Millions of years passed in the blink of an eye. Within the endless history of evolution, such spans were little more than fleeting moments. Finally, the clock stopped at 4.4 million years ago. At the same time, the system's mechanical voice echoed in the ears of every civilization observer. The age of giant beasts has become history. Mammals have taken the stage of evolution and diversified into countless forms. A new competition is about to begin. A new ruler of the world will soon emerge. The latest version of Earth Online has officially launched. Civilization observers, you have 30 minutes to select the species you wish to observe. As the announcement ended, people inside the virtual space began disappearing one after another. A bright flash filled my vision. When I opened my eyes again, I found myself standing on a prehistoric grassland from 4.4 million years ago. Soft soil rested beneath my feet. The air was unbelievably fresh, far cleaner than anything in the modern world. In the distance, I could see large animals moving across the landscape. At that moment, the official species selection phase had finally begun. Standing there, I felt as though I had temporarily obtained the perspective of a creator gazing down upon the entire world. The problem was that everyone only had 30 minutes to make their choice. There was no way to thoroughly investigate every species from beginning to end. Every civilization observer had to first determine a direction based on the version preview, then study the available information, conduct a quick field inspection, and finally lock in a target as fast as possible. The rules were the same as previous versions. If multiple observers selected the same species, the system would force them into a random competition. It could be rock, paper, scissors, an intelligence challenge, or even a pure physical contest. The winner would claim the species, while the loser would be forced to find another target. If someone failed to choose before time ran out, the system would assign a species randomly. The moment those rules were announced, the live stream exploded. Inside Dragon Nation's exclusive channel, most viewers had already decided that the saber-toothed cats were the ultimate answer for this version. The preview scene showing them effortlessly hunting massive mammals had simply been too impressive. Others preferred a safer approach and argued that choosing the elephant family would be wiser. At the very least, they were huge, stable, and reliable. But more people were worried about something else entirely. They weren't debating what species should be chosen, they were wondering whether I even knew how to choose. According to all the information circulating online, I was a notorious underachiever who slept through classes and spent most of his time slacking off. In the previous version, a certain nation had already suffered because its observer failed to secure the strongest dinosaur, creating problems that ultimately led to defeat. Now that it was my turn, nobody dared expect much. But from the very beginning, I had no intention of competing with the entire world for a saber-toothed tiger. In my eyes, the true answer to this version wasn't any of those mighty beasts that currently looked so dominant. The real answer was a species disguised beneath the appearance of uselessness, a god-tier species hidden behind a trash-tier shell, Ardipithecus, or, to be more precise, the future terrifying upright ape. The so-called terrifying upright ape was simply a nickname for the evolutionary path that would eventually produce humanity. Ardipithecus represented one of the most critical transitional stages leading toward humans. The only problem was that at the current timeline of 4.4 million years ago, they were pitifully weak. Surrounded by massive predators roaming the forests and grasslands, they barely survived from day to day. According to normal history, they would still require more than 2 million years of evolution before upright walking, tool usage, fire mastery, and advanced cooperation would gradually mature, allowing them to truly become the species that would dominate the world. But normal history was far too slow, and I possessed 3 opportunities to directly intervene in evolution. To put it bluntly, those 3 interventions were cheats. As long as they were used correctly, I could dramatically shorten the entire evolutionary timeline. Looking across all species in this version, none possessed potential that could compare to the future human race. While everyone else saw a weak little ape, I saw the ultimate answer, the future ruler of the food chain, the species that would reshape the entire world order. Without the slightest hesitation, I opened Ardipithecus's data panel. Species, Ardipithecus. Strength, 3 stars. Running speed, 2 stars. Neural response, 3 stars. Endurance, 4 stars. Intelligence, 5 stars. Energy consumption, 6 stars. It was a stat sheet that would make almost anyone frown. The strength was poor, the speed was poor, the reactions were average. Even the endurance was only slightly above mediocre. The only somewhat impressive category was intelligence. But the energy consumption was absurdly high, reaching 6 stars. In other words, they needed a lot of food, consumed enormous resources, and had almost no room for error. In nature, this was practically the textbook definition of a species that deserved extinction. At the same time, Dragon Nation's research team was also monitoring my screen. Elder Chin watched as I repeatedly lingered on Ardipithecus's information panel, and his frown deepened. The comparison was simply too brutal. Right next door, the short-sword, saber-toothed tiger boasted strength 7 stars, speed 5 stars, neural response 7 stars, endurance 6 stars, intelligence 4 stars, and energy consumption 5 stars. Aside from slightly lower intelligence, it was practically the perfect all-around warrior. The elephant family might have been slow, but their strength often reached 8 or even 9 stars. They embodied the philosophy of overwhelming power, crushing everything else. Balanced species had their advantages. Specialized species had their strengths. But Ardipithecus? Other than its ridiculous energy consumption, there was nothing remotely attractive about it. Elder Chin genuinely believed I was only taking a casual look and would soon move on. To be fair, I did begin checking other species afterward. I reviewed more than 10 different candidates in succession. Seeing that, the research team finally relaxed a little, assuming I was at least making comparisons. But the truth was completely different. I was merely confirming my own judgment. After all, almost nobody would compete for a species like Ardipithecus. It was practically the bottom tier of the entire version. Even if someone did choose it, nobody in this world understood evolution properly. They believed in divine creation and never considered evolutionary chains. Nobody could see the value hidden inside this card. Nobody could imagine that humanity would one day emerge from such weak and insignificant apes. And even if I somehow failed to obtain Ardipithecus, I was still confident that my 3 interventions could guide another species safely to the version's final settlement. But if I wanted first place, there was only one path worth betting on. After reviewing enough data, I finally made my move. I directly selected the habitat of Ardipithecus and activated teleportation. The next second, I vanished from the grassland and appeared at the edge of a sparse forest. However, a nearby area was unusually crowded. Around a lakeside habitat, 7 or 8 civilization observers had gathered together. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. David from the Beautiful Nation was there, Natasha from Bear Nation was there, Yamamoto Tetsuya from Sakura Nation was there as well. This was the habitat of the short-sword, saber-toothed tiger. It was obvious that these people were fighting over one of the hottest species in the entire version. The moment I appeared, several pairs of eyes immediately turned toward me. Yamamoto Tetsuya narrowed his eyes, his hostility obvious. David instinctively became cautious. clearly assuming I was another competitor. Only Natasha reacted differently. The moment she noticed me, she stepped forward and extended an olive branch. Natasha clearly wanted to take a gamble and fight for the saber-toothed tiger, but before she could say anything else, I simply waved my hand and calmly refused. You guys can fight over that. I already have my target, so I won't interfere. After saying that, I didn't hesitate for even a second. I turned around and walked straight past the short-sword saber-toothed tiger habitat. That single action stunned everyone. Not only the observers standing there, but even the livestream audience froze. One of the hottest species of the entire version was right in front of me, yet I didn't even bother competing for it. Even if winning wasn't guaranteed, shouldn't I at least have tried? But I skipped the entire process and left without looking back. For a moment, nobody could understand what I was thinking. However, they soon stopped paying attention because another issue demanded their focus. Once the final 10 minutes arrived, the system would forcibly pull everyone competing for the same species into a challenge. The winner would take everything, while the losers would be eliminated from the competition for that species. The battle over the short-sword saber-toothed tiger was destined to become one of the fiercest contests of the version. Meanwhile, I had already walked deep into the forest and stopped beneath a tree. Hidden among the branches, a small ape cautiously peeked through the leaves. Its eyes constantly scanned the surroundings, looking more like a frightened little animal prepared to flee at any moment than a future ruler of the world. I glanced up at it before submitting my choice to the system. Dragon Nation Civilization Observer confirms observation target, Ardipithecus. Since nobody else had selected it, a beam of light quickly descended and enveloped both me and the ape. The system's mechanical voice sounded one announcement after another. Dragon Nation Civilization Observer Yang Chen has confirmed observation target, Ardipithecus. Binding in progress. Binding successful. The moment the news was released, Dragon Nation practically exploded. Inside the research headquarters, Elder Chin's teacup slipped from his hand and smashed onto the floor. Scalding water splashed onto his pants, yet he didn't even notice. The entire room first fell into dead silence before a wave of shocked gasps erupted. Out of all the powerful species available, I had chosen the one that was weak in almost every category. If that wasn't insanity, what was? What terrified them even more was my personal file. According to the records, I had become emotionally unstable after my breakup and seemed to have completely given up on life. Some researchers even began suspecting that something was seriously wrong with me mentally, and that I was intentionally trying to drag Dragon Nation down with me. The more they thought about it, the more hopeless they became. After all, it was difficult to imagine any normal person making such a decision under these circumstances. As for the global audience, they treated the entire situation as a massive joke. Viewers from various countries immediately flooded the chats with mockery. Some sarcastically suggested that Dragon Nation was embracing a spirit of self-sacrifice and intentionally giving everyone else an advantage. Others directly claimed that Dragon Nation had handed away its national destiny. Some even brought up the Monkey King, joking that maybe a monkey could really cause havoc in heaven. Dragon Nation's viewers were furious, but they couldn't effectively fight back. The statistics of Ardipithecus were simply too terrible. No matter how hard they tried to defend the choice, they lacked confidence. As for me, I couldn't care less about any of it. In my eyes, Ardipithecus was the ultimate late-game god. If I had to divide its development into stages, then the moment it unlocked the ability to throw objects, it would officially enter its late-game form. And once that happened, who would still dare claim it wasn't the strongest answer in the version? The 30-minute selection period quickly came to an end, and every nation finalized its species. The most anticipated battle, the competition for the short-sword saber-toothed tiger, produced an unexpected winner. Che Taehyun claimed victory and secured the species. Even more surprising, David from the Beautiful Nation was the very first competitor eliminated during the contest. After losing the saber-toothed tiger, he immediately shifted targets and successfully secured the Argentine giant eagle, becoming the ruler of the skies. Natasha from Bear Nation also lost the saber-toothed tiger, but later won the competition for an elephant species and obtained a powerful giant elephant. The one who truly devastated Dragon Nation's viewers, however, was Yamamoto Tetsuya. He had failed repeatedly and ended up relying entirely on random assignment. Yet the system somehow handed him a giant hunting dog, a powerful pack-hunting predator. His luck was simply outrageous. The atmosphere in Dragon Nation's livestream became even gloomier. Their own observer had voluntarily selected what looked like the weakest species in existence, while their rivals were obtaining top-tier choices even through random chance. How was anyone supposed to compete with that? Soon afterward, the system officially announced the start of the new version. All Civilization observers returned to the virtual space and sat before individual chairs. In front of each observer appeared a real-time evolutionary screen displaying the progress of their chosen species. Since a single version often covered forward hundreds of thousands or even millions of years, the system compressed the timeline into roughly 1 month. It would advance like a nature documentary, rapidly skipping through time while preserving only the critical events. Thus, the fate of Ardipithecus officially unfolded before the eyes of the entire world. Once the image stabilized, the first thing everyone noticed was environmental deterioration. Due to dramatic climate shifts, what had once been a relatively dense rainforest had become increasingly sparse. The distance between trees continued expanding. The little ape bound to me sat atop a lonely tree, nervously scanning the world below. There were already very few members of its kind living in this woodland. Food had always been limited, and now every edible fruit on the trees had already been picked clean. The small ape hadn't eaten anything for 2 full days. The situation was even crueler than that. Earlier that morning, an elderly ape had starved to death. After falling from a tree, its body had been dragged away by a short-sword saber-toothed tiger within minutes. The little ape didn't fully understand what death meant, yet deep within its genes, an unbreakable law constantly warned it of one thing. The ground was dangerous. The moment it touched the earth, threats would surround it from every direction. But hunger was also pushing it toward death. Standing on a branch, it stared at another patch of forest roughly 100 meters away. There might be fruit there. There might be survival. There might be hope. Yet for an Ardipithecus that knew only how to swing and leap between trees, those 100 meters felt less like a distance and more like an uncrossable heavenly barrier. The little ape stared at the ground beneath the tree. Every cell in its body seemed to be screaming a warning. Fear forced it to retreat instinctively, climbing back toward thicker and higher branches as though the farther it stayed from the ground, the safer it would be. Meanwhile, Dragon Nation's live stream had already descended into despair. Countless viewers were convinced they were witnessing a hopeless start destined for extinction. There was no food left in the trees, while the ground below was filled with predators. As far as they could see, these apes had no future at all. Yet I never looked away from the screen. In fact, I was paying closer attention than anyone else, because I knew that history's most important step might be only moments away. Inside that tiny brain, no bigger than an orange, hunger and fear were engaged in a desperate battle. It couldn't think clearly like a human. It couldn't analyze possibilities or weigh outcomes. But the instinct to survive was every bit as powerful. For millions of years, trees had protected the ancestors of humanity. They had depended on branches for safety and survival, but now the world had changed. The trees were disappearing. The environment was changing. The old way of living no longer worked. If they wanted to survive, they would have to let go. Finally, hunger defeated fear. The little ape grabbed a branch and lowered its body into the air. It paused for a brief moment, then it released its grip. With a soft thud, it landed on the ground for the first time in its life. Fear instantly flooded back into its body. It looked around in panic, as though death might leap out from any direction at any moment. But survival didn't give it time to hesitate. Supporting itself with both hands and feet, it began running and jumping desperately toward the forest 100 meters away. As it ran, however, its hands became increasingly inconvenient. Little by little, its waist straightened. The crawling motion it had relied upon began transforming into something closer to upright running. Its strides grew larger, its posture became straighter, and before it even realized what it was doing, it had already reached the edge of the new forest and thrown itself into a world filled with fruit-bearing trees. It survived. More importantly, every ape remaining in the sparse woodland witnessed the entire scene. They poked their heads from the branches and stared at the little ape devouring fruit in the distance. They didn't understand concepts like strategy or learning from experience. They couldn't discuss routes or compare outcomes, but hunger was the most primitive and honest force in nature. The first ape had succeeded. Soon, the second and third began feeling restless. Before long, another ape dropped from the trees, then came a third, a fourth. More and more Ardipithecus descendants leapt from their branches and sprinted toward the distant forest. The ground was still dangerous, but it was no longer an absolute taboo. In Dragon Nation's livestream, some viewers couldn't help feeling moved. Many admitted they had never expected anything from these apes, yet watching them force themselves to take that step for survival still struck something deep inside them. However, most people remained pessimistic. From their perspective, all that had happened was that a group of weak creatures had finally learned to come down from the trees in search of food. Compared to the powerful predators already hunting large mammals in coordinated groups, the gap still seemed impossibly vast. But just as everyone was struggling with mixed emotions, an even crueler scene unfolded. 20 or 30 apes had begun running across the ground. The commotion inevitably attracted the attention of a nearby short-sword saber-toothed tiger. At first, even the predator seemed surprised. These timid creatures normally hid among the trees, yet today they were openly exposing themselves on the ground. The saber-toothed tiger slowly lowered its body and approached in complete silence. It waited patiently until the distance was perfect. Then it exploded forward. One leap, one impact. The ape it targeted didn't even have the right to resist. The difference in size was simply too great. One paw of the saber-toothed tiger was nearly as large as half the ape's body. Then its enormous jaws opened. The mouth stretched nearly 120 degrees wide, revealing two terrifying saber-like fangs. The deadly teeth plunged downward with ruthless precision, instantly severing the ape's chance of survival. The struggling weakened rapidly. Within seconds, the ape stopped moving altogether. The saber-toothed tiger picked up the corpse and dragged it away. The entire hunt was so clean and efficient that it felt almost merciless. Instantly, the live stream of Hai Bang Nation erupted in celebration. After all, Che Taehyun had chosen the short-sword saber-toothed tiger, and the prey his species had just killed happened to belong to Dragon Nation's Ardipithecus line. Large numbers of viewers immediately flooded into Dragon Nation's livestream to mock them. Messages filled the screen. "Thanks for the free delivery. These monkeys can't fight back at all. You practically handed us victory yourselves." The taunts came non-stop. Dragon Nation's viewers were already frustrated, and this pushed them over the edge. They immediately launched a counterattack, storming the opposing live streams in overwhelming numbers. Within a short time, the chat of Hai Bang Nation's stream was practically buried beneath Dragon Nation's viewers. It almost looked like a second Dragon Nation livestream. But none of those arguments mattered to me. To me, losing one or two Ardipithecus wasn't important at all. Nature had always advanced through brutal selection. What truly mattered was that the entire species had finally stepped onto the ground. Under the pressure of life and death, they had begun learning how to run. They had begun learning how to straighten their bodies. Because in my eyes, this step was even more important than fire or tools. Upright posture was the foundation of everything. Without it, there would be no future humanity. Without it, there would be no civilization. Without it, there would be no ruler standing at the top of the food chain. This seemingly insignificant step was the moment the future truly began. The reason primates were able to walk down this path in the first place was because they had spent countless generations climbing and leaping among branches. To grip trees effectively, their feet had evolved to become broad and flexible, almost like additional hands, giving them exceptional grasping ability. That single trait gave them a chance that most other animals never possessed: the ability to truly support and straighten their bodies. Predators throughout nature followed a completely different route. Cats, for example, walked on their toes, sacrificing stability for explosive speed. Prey species pushed this even further, with many becoming digitigrade or even hoofed runners, practically sprinting on their toenails. They gained incredible speed, but in doing so, they abandoned any possibility of genuine upright posture. And only upright posture could truly free the hands. Once the hands no longer needed to support the body or assist with running, they could gradually evolve toward greater precision: grasping, pinching, holding, manipulating, striking, throwing. Every ability that would one day define humanity was built upon a single foundation: the hands becoming available. Intelligence alone wasn't enough. Only after reaching that stage could tools emerge. Only then could fire ever be mastered. Otherwise, even if another animal somehow understood the principle behind friction fire, what would it use? Its mouth? It could spend an entire year rubbing sticks together with its teeth and never create a spark. That was why I wasn't in a hurry. I could wait. I would wait until Ardipithecus truly stood upright, until that action became embedded within the instincts of the entire species. Only after the foundation stabilized would it be time for my first intervention. The footage continued advancing. The apes that reached the new forest had survived, at least for now, but what happened that day meant far more than simply finding food. For the first time, they had climbed down from the trees. For the first time, they had crossed a 100-meter death zone. For the first time, they learned that the ground was dangerous but not absolutely forbidden. What they did today would gradually settle into their instincts like primitive lines of code. The next time food became scarce, they would migrate again. And the time after that, then again, once, twice, 20 times, 30 times. Until one day, the Earth would no longer symbolize fear. It would become home. Evolution had always worked this way. Life learned to adapt through danger. Through adaptation, it learned to utilize its surroundings. And eventually, it learned to conquer them. As evening arrived, the prehistoric sun slowly sank below the horizon. The sky was so clean it almost felt unreal. There were no steel cities, no smoke, no pollution. Looking upward revealed nothing but an endless sea of stars. High among the branches, the little ape that had first jumped to the ground sat quietly. Under normal circumstances, it would already be asleep by now, but today it had eaten too much. Its stomach was uncomfortably full, forcing it to remain seated. So it simply sat there, doing nothing. The wind brushed through its thin fur. Then, through a gap between the leaves, its eyes drifted toward the night sky. It saw the stars, and it kept looking, not for a glance, not for a second. It stared. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 1 hour, 2 hours. At that moment, the heavenly screen focused entirely on the little ape. Nobody knew what it was doing. Nobody knew what it was thinking. Logically speaking, a brain no larger than an orange shouldn't have been capable of something as sophisticated as thought. But was that really true? As the heavenly screen remained fixed on the ape staring at the stars, Dragon Nation's research team and countless viewers became increasingly frustrated. Other civilization observers were busy analyzing data, studying habits, identifying weaknesses, and planning future interventions. They were figuring out how to increase strength, improve speed, alter environments, and push their species toward perfection. Yet I seemed completely fascinated by a single ape sitting on a branch. My observation perspective refused to move away. To everyone else, this appeared completely meaningless. Instead of watching an ape that had eaten too much and was now sitting around doing nothing, shouldn't I be observing the rest of the Ardipithecus population? At least that might reveal physiological weaknesses or future evolutionary opportunities. Even Elder Chin couldn't understand what I was trying to accomplish. Aside from assuming I was slacking off, nobody could think of another explanation. But nobody understood what upright walking truly meant for Ardipithecus. And nobody understood what it meant for an ape to stare at the stars for the first time. Perhaps it wasn't genuine thought yet. That tiny orange-sized brain still couldn't process complex logic. But awareness was clearly beginning to emerge. And once awareness appeared, curiosity, fear, courage, disappointment, and countless other primitive emotions would inevitably follow. Why was it staring at those lights in the sky? Maybe it was simply curious about what they were. Maybe it wondered whether they could be eaten. Maybe the stars were just bright, distant, and captivating enough that it forgot to look away. The reason didn't matter. The outcome did. At that moment, it became curious about the stars. And that curiosity itself was something revolutionary. The little ape would probably never touch those lights during its brief lifetime. It would never discover the answers to its questions. Yet that first spark of curiosity would remain. Like a faint but stubborn signal, it would slowly sink into the depths of its lineage, passed down through blood, passed down through generations. And one day, somewhere in the distant future, one of its descendants might look up at the same sky on an ordinary night and see those same stars again. Perhaps that descendant would wonder just a little longer. Ask one question more. Take one step farther. And from that endless chain of curiosity, a species would eventually be born that refused to stop looking upward. A species that would not only gaze at the stars, but one day reach for them. The little ape continued staring at the stars. And somewhere deep within its genes, that same question began to take root. Generation after generation. 100 years. 1,000 years. 10,000 years. 1,000,000 years. Until millions of years later, that question, carried across unimaginable stretches of time, would finally receive an answer. For everyone else, Earth Online was simply a game that determined national destiny. But for me, it felt more like watching the complete history of human origins unfold right before my eyes. Tens of billions of years of evolution, beginning with single-celled life and progressing through countless stages, had finally produced the first creature capable of stopping, looking upward, and gazing into the universe. And only a few million years after that, humanity would step into the stars themselves. If looking up at the night sky was like discovering a precious gem lying on the ground, then all of human civilization that followed was merely the process of finally bending down and picking it up. That was why I carefully recorded that moment in my notebook. In my eyes, when the first ape lifted its head and stared into the galaxy, humanity had already completed 80% of its journey toward exploring the universe. Before long, my notebook was filled with notes. Yet the significance of what I had witnessed was something nobody except me could truly understand. Soon the heavenly screen accelerated once more. The rise and fall of a species never happened overnight. Ever since the first ape stepped onto the ground and ran toward a new forest to survive, that behavior had gradually spread throughout the entire population. When the fruit in the new forest eventually disappeared, the Ardipithecus didn't remain trapped in the trees like they once had. Instead, they climbed down again, then again, a third time, a fourth time. They continued migrating toward distant lands. Since their original environment could no longer support them, they chased food and adapted to new habitats. Slowly, trees ceased to be their only home. They spent more and more time on the ground, surviving despite being relentlessly hunted by every major predator around them. The key that made all of this possible was upright walking. The disadvantages of upright posture were obvious. They became slower. Escaping predators became more difficult, yet the benefits were equally significant. The first was energy efficiency. Four-legged movement functioned like permanent four-wheel drive, with four support points working simultaneously. It was stable, but extremely energy-intensive. Walking on two legs functioned more like an inverted pendulum. The body continuously leaned forward and then corrected itself, utilizing gravitational energy to assist movement. The result was lower energy consumption. On the system's six-dimensional evaluation chart, Ardipithecus's previously absurd 6-star energy consumption dropped to 5 stars. But that wasn't the only advantage. Upright posture also offered a much more direct physical benefit: heat management. Most four-legged animals exposed their entire backs to the sun. Their large surface area absorbed tremendous amounts of heat, making long-distance movement exhausting. Once Ardipithecus began standing upright, the amount of body surface directly exposed to sunlight decreased dramatically. Their bodies could dissipate heat more effectively, allowing them to travel under high temperatures for much longer periods. As a result, their endurance increased even further. They could walk farther, survive longer, search larger areas for food. Thus, a species that appeared unbelievably weak somehow managed to survive from the very beginning of the version. Not only survive, but gradually begin expanding and strengthening. Soon the heavenly screen focused on a pregnant female Ardipithecus. Her swollen abdomen carried the next generation of her species. This should have been a symbol of hope, yet it was here that the most devastating cost of upright walking revealed itself for the first time. The moment labor began, the female was overcome with agony. The entire birthing process was far more difficult than anyone expected. Instinctively, she let out sharp, painful cries that echoed across the wilderness. For modern humans, screams during childbirth simply represented pain, but in the prehistoric world, such cries were practically an invitation to death. A nearby predator could hear them and arrive at any moment, potentially wiping out the entire group. Fortunately, luck was on their side this time. No large predators happened to be nearby, but everyone understood the problem. Nature didn't grant miracles forever. Inside Dragon Nation's research headquarters, Elder Chin finally understood what was happening. He pointed out that gorillas and monkeys could occasionally stand upright, but that wasn't true human-style bipedalism. Their pelvises remained wider. Their legs were shorter. To maintain balance, they needed obvious outward-angled leg movements. Most importantly, they still depended heavily on their hands. Forget running long distances. They struggled even with stable movement. Ardipithecus was different. From the moment they first stepped onto the ground and throughout the generations that followed, their bodies continued straightening. The distance between their legs narrowed. Their movement patterns became increasingly similar to those of humans. In other words, they were beginning to master a characteristic that should have belonged exclusively to humanity. Within Blue Star's current understanding of the world, this revelation was almost explosive. After all, creationism dominated global belief. Humans were considered unique and superior creations. Who would willingly accept that a group of apes inside a game was gradually replicating human abilities? Yet biological laws didn't care about ideology. The real problem soon became impossible to ignore. Upright walking meant the pelvis gradually narrowed. At the same time, the fetus continuously shifted downward under the influence of gravity. For most four-legged mammals, childbirth was a relatively natural process. Many mothers could even give birth while standing. Egg-laying animals had it even easier. They simply laid eggs. Ardipithecus, however, faced a completely different reality. Their increasingly narrow pelvis transformed childbirth into a genuine life-and-death ordeal. On the heavenly screen, the female Ardipithecus suffered for more than an hour before finally managing to deliver her infant. One small complication would have been enough to kill both mother and child. Watching her struggle, I understood something that almost nobody else realized. Evolution never handed out gifts for free. Every advantage carried a cost. Every step toward the future demanded sacrifice. And the path leading toward humanity was no exception. The first creatures to walk upright were paying the price so that countless generations later, their descendants could one day stand beneath the stars and finally understand the questions that began on this very night. The newborn had to arrive early, just like a human baby, entering the world in an unfinished state. That was precisely why human children required such a long time before learning to walk, while most mammals could stand and run shortly after birth. For humans sitting comfortably at the top of the food chain, this wasn't a major issue. But for Ardipithecus, constantly surrounded by predators, it was practically a death sentence. They were already a weak species. Childbirth was extraordinarily difficult. Their offspring were incredibly fragile. No matter how anyone looked at it, their evolutionary path seemed like a road to extinction. As a result, Dragon Nation's research team quickly reached a consensus. If an opportunity for outside intervention appeared later, the safest option might be to actively interfere and force Ardipithecus to abandon upright walking altogether, returning to a more suitable, four-legged lifestyle. Elder Chin even instructed his researchers to begin recording pelvic structures, spinal development, muscular changes, and locomotion data. They wanted to prepare a plan to correct what they viewed as a catastrophic evolutionary mistake. Meanwhile, viewers in Dragon Nation's livestream lacked the scientific expertise of the research team, but they were equally horrified. Over in Bear Nation's stream, elephant calves could stand and walk immediately after birth. At the very least, they possessed a basic ability to survive. Here, however, newborn Ardipithecus infants looked like unfinished lumps of flesh. The mothers were left completely exhausted after childbirth. Throughout the version so far, other species had either been dominating their environments or demonstrating incredible combat power. Only Ardipithecus seemed to spend its entire existence running for its life. Their diet consisted mostly of fruits and roots. No matter how people looked at it, they seemed inferior in every category. Yet I still didn't move, because in my eyes, a fatal weakness wasn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it became the very force that pushed evolution toward a breakthrough. Just as environmental pressure had forced them out of the trees, life often discovered new paths only when cornered by death. So I continued watching without using any of my intervention opportunities. Soon the heavenly screen provided a closer look. The newborn Ardipithecus was exactly as fragile as everyone feared. Its eyes remained closed. Its limbs were tiny and weak. Sparse fur barely covered its body. It could only lie on a large leaf prepared by its mother, wriggling slightly like a tiny caterpillar. Soft cries escaped its mouth, the only way it could communicate its needs. The mother ape was already on the verge of collapse, yet the maternal instinct engraved into the genes of all mammals continued driving her forward. Struggling against exhaustion, she pulled the infant into her arms and attempted to nurse it. But childbirth had drained almost every ounce of her strength and nutrition. She couldn't produce even a single drop of milk. Without food, this underdeveloped infant wouldn't survive a single day. The situation became even crueler when considering the others nearby. There were other Ardipithecus around them, but they only gathered together because groups were safer than isolation. They had no concept of helping one another. They could see the mother's desperation, but they didn't understand what they should do. Assistance was still an unfamiliar concept at this stage of evolution. The mother looked around helplessly. For the first time, a complicated emotion seemed to emerge within her otherwise empty eyes. Eventually, her gaze settled upon a larger and stronger male Ardipithecus nearby. Biologically, he was the infant's father. According to the most common rules of nature, a male provided genetic material and then left. Raising offspring was typically the female's responsibility. Yet this time, something unexpected happened. The male primitive ape moved toward a patch of grass and retrieved 2 fruits he had hidden earlier. Holding them carefully, he walked over to the mother and made several soft chirping sounds, as if attempting to communicate something he couldn't quite express. Somehow the mother appeared to understand. She practically snatched the fruit from his hands and hurriedly ate it. She knew she needed nutrition immediately if she wanted to produce milk and keep the infant alive. What surprised everyone even more was the male's reaction. He showed no dissatisfaction at all about losing his food. Instead, he tilted his head. First, he looked at the mother, then at the tiny infant. By now, his brain had grown beyond the size of an orange and was approaching something closer to a grapefruit. Increased brain capacity brought more than faster reactions. It also brought the beginnings of judgment. For perhaps the first time in his life, he seemed to realize that the fragile little creature shared a connection with him. Deep down, offspring represented the most fundamental code of all life. No matter what species existed, everything ultimately revolved around reproduction and continuation. And so, he appeared to complete the most difficult act of thinking he had ever performed. If the infant was going to survive, then the mother needed to survive first. And if the mother was carrying and protecting the infant, she couldn't search for food alone, which meant that until the infant grew stronger, someone else would have to stay. At that moment, he may have touched the edge of something entirely new: responsibility. To everyone else, this looked insignificant. A male ape had simply handed over 2 pieces of fruit. Nothing more, nothing less. But the sight struck me deeply, because I knew this moment was just as important as the first ape jumping down from a tree and stepping onto the ground. Evolution was never a miracle that happened overnight. It was countless tiny changes, each seemingly insignificant on its own, piling together under the pressure of survival until an entire species was transformed. Upright walking had created a childbirth crisis so severe that Ardipithecus could no longer survive through individual effort alone. A single mother couldn't raise such fragile offspring. If their descendants were going to survive, a new social structure would have to emerge. And so the concept of family began to take shape. The male didn't leave. Instead, he gradually remained beside the mother and infant. At first, he didn't know what to do. He simply stayed nearby and watched. But over time, he began venturing out in search of food and bringing it back. It was here that another massive advantage of upright walking finally revealed itself: carrying. No matter how powerful a four-legged animal was, the only reliable way it could transport resources was with its mouth. A predator might drag prey somewhere safer, but it couldn't carry heavy food over long distances while simultaneously defending itself. Anything it couldn't finish eating was often abandoned and left for scavengers. Ardipithecus was different. Upright posture had freed both hands. They could carry objects in their arms. They could transport food from one location to another. They could bring excess resources back to their mates and offspring. What seemed like a simple ability to carry things would eventually become one of the most important advantages in the history of life. Because from transporting food would come resource storage. From resource storage would come cooperation. From cooperation would come society. And all of it began with a pair of hands that no longer needed to touch the ground. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. In reality, it was terrifyingly important. Because the moment food could be reliably carried back to the group, the entire cost structure of raising offspring changed. The mother no longer needed to risk her life searching for food during her weakest moments. Instead, she could devote more energy to nurturing her young. The infant, receiving longer and more stable care, suddenly had a much higher chance of survival. In other words, the reproductive disadvantages caused by upright walking didn't drive Ardipithecus toward extinction. Instead, they forced the species to solve the problem through cooperation. And once cooperation within a family appeared, something even more profound followed. The foundation of civilization. Families created stable division of labor. Division of labor created higher levels of cooperation. And when cooperation and conflict began existing side by side, civilization finally became possible. That was why, in my eyes, upright walking and the concept of family were two of the most important pieces of the puzzle. The picture was still incomplete, but the direction couldn't have been clearer. Before long, this change expanded beyond individuals and spread throughout the population. Ardipithecus no longer searched for food alone. They moved in groups of 3, 4, or 5. More individuals meant more eyes watching for danger. Their awareness improved dramatically. They naturally divided their attention, constantly scanning different directions. The moment one of them noticed suspicious movement, it immediately sounded an alarm. Some groups had even begun displaying the earliest signs of coordinated retreats and mutual protection. Ironically, the first people to notice something was wrong weren't Dragon Nation at all. It was Haibang Nation. Their observed species happened to be the short-sword, saber-toothed tiger. For a very long time, Ardipithecus had been one of the tiger's easiest and most reliable prey sources. Every time viewers watched a saber-toothed tiger effortlessly capture one of my apes, they celebrated wildly. It was almost as if they couldn't surpass Dragon Nation in reality, so they took comfort in dominating us inside the game. But as time passed, something strange happened. Hunting Ardipithecus became noticeably harder. Previously, once a saber-toothed tiger targeted an ape, success was almost guaranteed. Now, however, the apes frequently detected danger long before the predator reached striking distance. They would immediately flee. More importantly, their escapes were becoming increasingly organized. Soon, the heavenly screen provided the perfect demonstration. Che Taehyun focused his observation perspective on a saber-toothed tiger living near one of the Ardipithecus gathering areas. The predator quickly lived up to expectations. It spotted signs of ape activity from a great distance away. The tiger also understood something important. If it rushed recklessly into dense woodland and thick vegetation, the apes could simply climb back into the trees. That would turn an easy hunt into a failure. So it chose patience. The greatest weapon of an apex predator wasn't simply its ability to pounce, it was its ability to wait. Hidden within tall grass, the saber-toothed tiger remained completely motionless for hours. Then, at noon, when the sun was at its hottest, 4 Ardipithecus finally emerged together. Their timing wasn't random. It reflected accumulated experience. Most four-legged predators disliked moving under the scorching midday sun. Ardipithecus, benefiting from superior heat dissipation due to upright posture, could function more effectively during those hours. Unfortunately for them, this time they encountered a hunter patient enough to endure the heat. The saber-toothed tiger slowly lowered itself and crept forward. Every muscle tightened like a fully drawn bowstring waiting for release. Then, just as it prepared to launch itself forward, everything fell apart. One of the apes assigned to watch for danger suddenly noticed something unusual. It let out a sharp warning cry. The sound was filled with urgency. Even the saber-toothed tiger was startled by how sudden it was. In the next instant, all 4 Ardipithecus turned and fled. What happened afterward was even more impressive. Each ape ran in a different direction. Clearly, they had already developed an instinctive survival strategy. Once danger was detected, scatter immediately. Force the predator to choose. The saber-toothed tiger hesitated. It looked left, then right. It couldn't instantly decide which target to pursue. By the time it finally made a choice, the perfect attack window had vanished. The 4 apes had already spread far apart. At the same time, the brutal midday sun was rapidly raising the predator's body temperature. Its jaws opened wide as it panted heavily. Every instinct warned it that overheating was becoming a serious risk. Food was valuable, but not valuable enough to kill itself chasing it. In the end, the tiger could only watch helplessly as the apes escaped into the distance before retreating toward a shaded area. Hai Bang Nation's livestream immediately exploded. Their viewers couldn't accept what they were seeing. A group of creatures that were supposed to be easy prey had somehow become increasingly difficult to catch. More importantly, they refused to believe Ardipithecus had accomplished this naturally. In their minds, there was only one explanation. I had secretly used an intervention. Otherwise, how could such weak apes repeatedly escape from under the nose of a saber-toothed tiger? The more they thought about it, the more convinced they became. Even Che Taehyun eventually turned toward my direction with a frown. He had practically convinced himself that I had already spent one of my intervention opportunities. In his opinion, I had probably enhanced Ardipithecus's neural reactions or vigilance, allowing them to detect danger earlier. What he didn't know was that I hadn't used a single intervention yet. Not one. But honestly, that detail didn't matter anymore. Hai Bang Nation had already decided that Dragon Nation struck first. Naturally, they weren't interested in sitting idle. Che Taehyun quickly made his decision. He immediately consumed one of his intervention opportunities and established contact with his outside support team. Earth Online's interventions were never as simple as adding stat points. Improving strength meant modifying muscle structures. Increasing size meant altering skeletal systems. If someone wanted a land animal to adapt to aquatic environments, they might have to redesign its entire respiratory system. One mistake could trigger a cascade of catastrophic consequences. You couldn't simply install gills on a terrestrial predator and call it a day. The result might be an animal that tried breathing through gills on land while still relying on lungs underwater, effectively killing itself through bad design. Because of that, Che Taehyun didn't dare make changes on his own. His intervention count dropped from 3 to 2, and communication with Hai Bang Nation's research team was established. On the other side, the researchers were already eager to act. They viewed this version as the perfect opportunity to build an overwhelming advantage. However, they didn't recommend directly modifying the saber-toothed tiger's body. The reason was simple. They didn't understand the species deeply enough yet. Reckless biological alterations could easily destroy the very advantages that made it powerful. Instead, they focused on something else entirely: behavior and habitat preference. Through long-term observation, they had discovered that short-sword saber-toothed tigers weren't strictly solitary. While they often hunted alone, they also lacked strong territorial exclusivity. Seeing 2, 3, or even 4 tigers occupying nearby regions wasn't uncommon. They existed somewhere between solitary and social behavior. If that was the case, there was no need to modify their bodies at all. They only needed to modify their instincts, make them feel dissatisfied with their current habitat. Make them believe another location was more suitable, and that ideal location happened to be the very region where Ardipithecus was currently thriving. The moment I realized what they were planning, I narrowed my eyes slightly, because unlike the crude stat boosts everyone expected, this was actually a clever move. They weren't strengthening the predator, they were moving the battlefield itself, and that made the situation far more dangerous. Even if the apes spotted danger early, escaping from a large-scale encirclement of apex predators would be nearly impossible. What made the situation even more terrifying was that this wasn't simply an attack against Ardipithecus. From Hai Bang Nation's perspective, they believed they had discovered the true hidden strategy of this version. The goal was no longer merely helping your own species survive. Instead, it was about using active interventions to launch ecological warfare, compressing the living space of competing species until they collapsed. Once the strategy was decided, Che Taehyun acted immediately. The region currently inhabited by Ardipithecus was already a highly diverse area containing forests, grasslands, hills, and dense shrublands. A few saber-toothed tigers naturally lived nearby, but after Hai Bang Nation's behavioral intervention took effect, every short-sword saber-toothed tiger across the continent suddenly developed the same subconscious impulse. Their current homes no longer felt comfortable, no longer felt ideal. The perfect habitat existed somewhere else, and that somewhere else happened to be exactly where Ardipithecus was living. Thus, a massive migration began. One saber-toothed tiger after another abandoned its territory and started moving toward a common destination. The heavenly screen even projected a continental map. Countless red dots slowly converged from every direction. At a rough estimate, there were already tens of thousands of them. Some would inevitably settle elsewhere along the way after discovering suitable environments. But the overall trend could no longer be reversed. An apex predator species was being artificially pushed into a large-scale concentration. Once enough of those predators gathered around the Ardipithecus territory, the consequences would extend far beyond a few hunting incidents. The entire ecological balance of the region would be rewritten. At that point, it wouldn't just be Ardipithecus that suffered. Countless nearby species would become victims of the incoming predator tide. Watching the growing mass of red dots on the map, Haibang Nation was practically celebrating already. In their minds, they could already see waves of saber-toothed tigers sweeping across the land, crushing Ardipithecus, while simultaneously eliminating every competing species. Dragon Nation, Sakura Nation. Everyone seemed destined to become the next casualties. For a time, the entire country appeared trapped in a beautiful fantasy of inevitable victory. The intervention worked astonishingly fast. Before long, the number of saber-toothed tigers inside Ardipithecus territory began skyrocketing. Previously, seeing 3 or 4 tigers in the same region was already unusual. Now they appeared everywhere in pairs and small groups. Their population had increased by at least tenfold, and it was still growing. As a result, the tiny amount of living space Ardipithecus had gained through cooperation, family structures, and collective vigilance was suddenly squeezed once again. Previously, spotting a single saber-toothed tiger simply meant running away. Now seeing one often meant several more were hidden nearby. Every trip outside in search of food risked walking directly into a predator trap. The odds of returning safely dropped with each passing day. Food supplies became unstable. The entire population once again found itself standing on the edge of extinction. Outside the game, Dragon Nation's live stream exploded. Everyone could tell Haibang Nation wasn't engaging in normal competition anymore. This was a direct attack aimed specifically at Dragon Nation. Some viewers cursed Haibang Nation's tactics. Others desperately begged me to act. "They've already intervened. Move the apes before more tigers arrive. Anything is better than staying here and waiting to die." Inside Dragon Nation's research headquarters, Elder Qin and the others were equally anxious. The frustrating part was that they couldn't contact me. Under the new rules, only the Civilization Observer could initiate outside assistance. Until I pressed that button, the research team couldn't even send a simple warning telling me to retreat. Of course, I had already noticed the abnormal increase in saber-toothed tiger numbers. I glanced toward Che Taehyun. Almost as if sensing my gaze, he looked back. Then a smug smile spread across his face. His lips moved silently. I could easily read the message. "You've already lost." I simply looked at him calmly before silently replying with 4 words of my own. "Short-sighted fool." Because from my perspective, Haibang Nation's strategy wasn't brilliant. It was dangerously foolish. Saber-toothed tigers already occupied the top of the food chain. Their individual power alone guaranteed them a dominant position. Yet Haibang Nation wasn't satisfied. They used an intervention to cram huge numbers of predators into the same area. In the short term, that certainly created overwhelming military superiority. But they had overlooked a fundamental truth. An ecosystem couldn't survive on predators alone. Increasing the number of hunters didn't magically create more prey. In fact, prey species would likely flee as danger levels increased. Once local prey populations were hunted down or scared away, the entire region would quickly collapse into resource scarcity. At that point, the concentrated saber-toothed tiger population wouldn't even be able to sustain itself. The situation would spiral out of control. In other words, what looked like an overwhelming display of pressure was actually little more than short-sighted exploitation. Besides, Ardipithecus didn't possess strong territorial instincts anyway. They had already spent generations migrating from forest to forest and eventually into hilly regions. Relocation wasn't some unfamiliar concept. Seeking safety and avoiding danger was one of the most basic instincts in nature. If conditions became unbearable, they would simply move again. That was why I wasn't worried about this wave destroying them outright. However, Haibang Nation's actions did remind me of something important. The foundations were finally in place. Upright walking existed. The concept of family had begun emerging. Cooperation had appeared. Since that was the case, it was finally time to install the first truly core ability. The first intervention I had planned from the very beginning. Unlocking throwing. Under normal evolutionary conditions, this ability would require hundreds of thousands of additional years. Ardipithecus would first need to fully adapt to upright walking and further modify its upper body structure before throwing could gradually emerge. But I didn't have hundreds of thousands of years to wait. The version timeline was moving too quickly, so I intended to accelerate the process directly. With that thought, I opened the complete Ardipithecus data panel and pressed the intervention button. The moment I did, Dragon Nation's research team finally let out a collective sigh of relief. At the very least, my action proved I wasn't planning to sit around doing nothing. Elder Qin immediately ordered every available analysis report to be prepared. The researchers scrambled to gather data, fully expecting that I would activate outside assistance and request recommendations for the intervention. They were ready to provide the most comprehensive advice possible the moment the connection opened. But then, in the very next second, something happened that none of them expected. The entire research team froze on the spot. They had expected me to immediately activate the bright green outside assistance button and request support. Instead, I ignored it completely and began making adjustments myself. Dragon Nation's researchers were left utterly dumbfounded. But my thinking couldn't have been clearer. For the future terrifying upright apes, the ancestors of humanity, the thing that would eventually place them at the top of the world wasn't their size. It wasn't raw strength either. It was a collection of abilities so strategically powerful that they completely changed the rules of survival. Upright walking was one of them. Throwing was another. If I wanted Ardipithecus to truly possess the power of throwing, the key wasn't simply teaching them how to toss objects. The key was rebuilding their bodies and giving them the biological hardware required for efficient, lethal projectile attacks. My attention immediately focused on their spine and shoulders. By now, Ardipithecus already possessed a distinctly different spinal structure from ordinary quadrupeds. Instead of the traditional C-shaped spine seen in most animals, they had begun developing a more human-like S-shaped spine. This detail was incredibly important. The S-shaped spine not only supported vertical loads during upright walking, but also provided far greater rotational ability through the waist and torso. It could function like a spring, storing and releasing energy. That rotational power was one of the most important foundations of throwing. Once that base existed, the next target was the shoulder. At this stage, the shoulders of Ardipithecus still resembled those of ordinary primates. They were relatively compact. Their range of motion was limited. The shoulder joints felt almost locked in place. They simply couldn't perform the dramatic backward arm extension required for powerful throwing. So the first thing I needed to do was unlock that restriction. I began by lengthening the clavicles, directly widening the shoulders, and making their upper body structure more human-like. Next, I adjusted the shoulder joints themselves, increasing their range of motion so the arms could draw much farther backward. After that, I strengthened the surrounding muscles, tendons, and ligaments, making the entire system both more stable and more elastic. Put simply, I was transforming the upper body of Ardipithecus into a living biological bow. The widened clavicles formed the frame. Expanded shoulder mobility created room to draw the bowstring. Strengthened tendons and ligaments became the string itself. The S-shaped spine and rotational waist stored additional energy. When the time came to throw, power would no longer come from the arm alone. It would begin at the feet, travel through the legs, rotate through the hips and waist, flow across the back and shoulders, and finally explode through the arm in one seamless transfer of momentum. The moment the system was completed, Ardipithecus would break free from one of the greatest limitations shared by almost every land animal on Earth, the restriction of melee combat. Before my intervention, they could technically throw things, but it was closer to tossing than true throwing. Their locked shoulders limited movement so severely that even with maximum effort, a thrown object traveled at only around 30 kilometers per hour and rarely reached beyond 5 to 10 meters. The threat level was minimal. After my modifications, however, everything changed. They could now draw their arms backward and unleash projectiles using the stored elastic energy of their entire bodies. This wasn't simply throwing anymore, it carried genuine striking force. 10 meters, 20 meters, dozens of meters. For most predators in nature, that distance represented an uncrossable gap. If you wanted to attack me, you first had to approach me. The moment you approached, I could retreat. The moment you hesitated, I could strike from range. And if future generations eventually unlocked tool use, the things being thrown would no longer be simple rocks. They would become increasingly dangerous weapons. That was the true horror of this ability. A predator could possess overwhelming close-range power, but if it couldn't establish contact, all that power became meaningless. This wasn't a simple advantage, it was dimensional superiority. That was why I understood better than anyone that this intervention wasn't an ordinary enhancement. It was an exclusive talent belonging only to Ardipithecus and their future descendants. No other species could replicate it, because this wasn't merely a shoulder modification, it was the result of upright posture, spinal structure, waist rotation, clavicle expansion, joint flexibility, and tendon elasticity all working together. It was a complete evolutionary package unique to the path leading toward humanity. After finishing the modifications, I examined the results and nodded in satisfaction. Then the intervention took effect. The changes I made were rapidly synchronized across the entire Ardipithecus population. One ape after another began undergoing subtle transformations. Their shoulders widened, their clavicles lengthened, the muscles along their upper backs became slightly more pronounced. Deep within their bodies, the foundation for one of humanity's most terrifying future abilities had finally been laid. And although nobody realized it yet, the moment those changes spread through the species, the balance between hunter and prey had already begun to shift. The age when Ardipithecus could do nothing but run was coming to an end. The first true weapon of humanity had just been born. However, the number of short-sword, saber-toothed tigers kept increasing. The forests that had once served as safe habitats for Ardipithecus were becoming more dangerous by the day. As a result, the apes were forced to retreat deeper into the mountains. Mountain terrain was far more complicated, making it difficult for saber-toothed tigers to launch effective charges. More importantly, the mountains contained naturally formed caves that were much safer than open woodland. At that moment, a female ape sat near the entrance of a cave, holding her infant in her arms. She was waiting for the males who had gone out searching for food to return. Ever since the concept of family had begun emerging, this division of labor had become increasingly natural. The females focused more on caring for offspring, while the males gradually took on the dangerous task of venturing outside. But today was different. The sky was already beginning to darken, and none of the foraging males had returned. Time passed little by little. Dusk descended. The outside world became increasingly dangerous. For Ardipithecus, nighttime was practically danger multiplied. Their night vision was nowhere near as good as that of predators. Once visibility disappeared, all the cooperation and vigilance they had developed became much harder to utilize. The female ape couldn't understand sophisticated emotions like worry, but she understood hunger. She needed food. The infant in her arms needed food even more. The other apes inside the cave needed it too. Finally, beneath the orange glow of the setting sun, several figures appeared in the distance. The foraging party had returned. There were 6 of them. Each carried a pile of fist-sized fruits in their arms. The female immediately became excited and began calling toward the others inside the cave. Soon, one ape after another rushed toward the entrance. The moment they saw their companions returning, instinctive excitement spread through the group. Food had arrived. They would survive another night. Yet as the 6 returning apes approached and deposited their fruits into a corner of the cave, something quickly felt wrong. Their expressions carried obvious traces of fear. Earlier that day, they had encountered 6 short-sword, saber-toothed tigers at once. The predators had appeared too quickly and attacked too aggressively. Their formation had collapsed almost instantly. Several companions had failed to escape. If the tiger pack hadn't become distracted by the prey it had already caught, the survivors wouldn't have made it back alive. Nobody needed words to explain what happened. The atmosphere itself told the story. Fortunately, low intelligence came with one advantage. They didn't linger in grief the way humans would. Their focus quickly shifted back to survival. Ardipithecus still possessed many animal traits. Their teeth remained relatively strong, allowing them to crack hard fruit shells through sheer effort, though doing so was exhausting. Soon the cave echoed with the sounds of chewing and cracking. However, the female carrying the infant only had one free hand. She struggled to generate enough force to break open her fruit. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't crack it. Growing increasingly frustrated, she suddenly noticed a stone near her feet. As if an idea had flashed through her mind, she placed the fruit on the ground, picked up the stone, raised it high above her head, and smashed downward. Crack! The shell split open instantly. The female's eyes lit up. Excited, she quickly stuffed the fruit inside her mouth. Across from her, another ape witnessed the entire scene. Her eyes widened immediately. She pointed toward the stone beside the female and then raised her own fruit. The meaning was obvious. "Can I borrow that?" The female understood. Acting entirely out of habit, she casually tossed the stone toward the other ape. The problem was that her body was no longer the same body as before. Her shoulders now possessed a greater range of motion. Her clavicles were longer. The entire throwing system I had designed was already in place. But she had no awareness of any of these changes. She used roughly the same amount of force she always had. The next moment, the stone shot forward at a speed far beyond anything she had ever produced before. Bang! The rock slammed directly into the other ape's forehead. The impact was so powerful that it knocked her backward onto the ground. Clutching her head, she rolled around screaming in pain. Every ape inside the cave froze in shock. The female froze as well. She clearly couldn't understand what had happened. It was just a small stone. How could it possibly have produced that much power? Yet after writhing around for a while, the injured ape gradually became aware of something unusual. Instead of remaining angry, she picked up the stone, the very object that had caused the accident, and began examining it over and over. She couldn't understand how such a tiny thing had generated such terrifying force. And deep within her rapidly evolving brain, a faint spark of curiosity began to emerge. Because for the first time, a stone wasn't simply a stone anymore. It had become something else. Something capable of extending the reach of her body. Something capable of producing power far beyond claws, teeth, or muscles alone. The other apes watched with equal fascination. None of them understood it yet. None of them had the words to describe it, but I knew exactly what I was looking at. Just as the first ape stepping onto the ground had marked the beginning of one revolution, this moment marked the beginning of another. Somewhere inside that cave, surrounded by frightened, hungry, half-evolved apes, the first faint outline of a weapon had just been born. The ape that had been hit by the stone was completely caught off guard. Clutching her head and crying out in pain, she suddenly realized something incredible. It was as if she had discovered a brand new world. Instantly, excitement replaced her frustration. She began frantically picking up stones and hurling them at every nearby companion. One ape failed to dodge. Then, another got hit. Before long, the entire cave descended into chaos. Apes were jumping around, dodging flying rocks, and screaming in confusion. The more stones she threw, the more excited she became. She was practically hopping with joy. Eventually, however, she pushed everyone's patience too far. Several apes tackled her at once and gave her a rather forceful lesson. Only then did she finally stop. Yet even after being restrained, she still desperately wanted to communicate something. The moment she broke free, she immediately pointed at the stones on the ground and began making exaggerated throwing motions. At the same time, she provided enthusiastic sound effects. Whoosh, bang, ooga, gaga. Through her combination of gestures and noises, the others gradually seemed to understand. The important thing wasn't any particular stone. The important thing was throwing the stone with force. That action itself was powerful. Soon, more apes began experimenting. Some threw stones into the distance. Others hurled them at tree trunks. It didn't take long for them to realize something astonishing. Once a stone was airborne, it generated far more force than anyone expected. Rocks smashed into thick tree trunks and left visible marks. One especially large male ape achieved an even more shocking result. Putting his full strength into the throw, he launched a stone dozens of meters away. The entire cave erupted into collective excitement. Before long, they discovered even more details. Stones that were too small lacked impact, stones that were too large couldn't travel far, but stones roughly the size of a palm provided the perfect balance between power and distance. Those became everyone's favorite. As a result, the entire group began obsessively collecting stones that felt just right. It was as though they had accidentally discovered the greatest toy in existence. They became so fascinated that they completely lost track of time. By the time darkness fully covered the mountains, they were still making noise inside the cave. Unfortunately, silence dominates the night, which meant noise stood out even more. At the same time, in Haibang Nation's livestream, Che Taehyun's observation screen was focused on 3 short-sword saber-toothed tigers still searching for food after sunset. The growing concentration of saber-toothed tigers had intensified competition dramatically. Many predators were no longer finding enough prey. These 3 happened to be among the hungry ones. Since food had become scarce on the plains and around the forest edges, they risked entering the mountains instead. And because of that decision, they soon heard the sounds echoing from the cave. Haibang Nation's viewers were briefly confused. Then their excitement exploded. Some had already checked Dragon Nation's stream and confirmed exactly what was happening. Inside that cave, a group of foolish apes was playing with rocks and making noise. To them, it looked like the perfect hunting opportunity. The 3 saber-toothed tigers immediately lowered their bodies and began moving silently toward the cave under the cover of darkness. Night was the greatest ally of every predator. Even massive hunters like these could become nearly invisible if they moved carefully. Before long, they reached the cave entrance. Inside Dragon Nation's live stream, viewers were already struggling to watch. Everyone understood the danger. In the past, even a single saber-toothed tiger had placed enormous pressure on Ardipithecus. Now there were 3. Worse, the cave was an enclosed space. If the entrance became blocked, dozens of apes would be trapped inside with nowhere to run. As expected, the leading tiger stepped into the mouth of the cave. It lifted its nose and sniffed the air. The scent of prey was everywhere. There were plenty of targets inside. The predator was already preparing to attack. But just as it was about to launch its ambush, something completely unexpected happened. A stone suddenly flew out of the cave. Smack! It struck the rocky wall nearby before bouncing down and landing at the tiger's feet. The sudden sound startled even the focused predator. It instinctively jumped backward 2 steps and growled at the strange object. That growl instantly silenced every ape inside the cave. They knew that sound better than anything. Short-sword, saber-toothed tiger. Their greatest nightmare. Under the faint moonlight, the apes finally saw the massive silhouette standing at the entrance. Its enormous body, its threatening shape, the sheer pressure it radiated felt powerful enough to fill the entire cave. Then things became even worse. 2 more shadows appeared on either side of the entrance. The escape route was completely sealed. 3 saber-toothed tigers, 3 living walls, dozens of apes huddled against the deepest part of the cave with nowhere left to retreat. After confirming that the strange stone wasn't alive, the lead tiger redirected its attention toward the clustered prey. It lowered its body once again. This time it wasn't trying to hide, it was preparing to charge. The other 2 predators mirrored the movement. In their eyes, the creatures before them were insignificant. What followed would simply be slaughter. The 3 predators launched forward simultaneously, and at that exact moment, One ape reacted differently from all the others. It was the same ape that had first discovered the power hidden inside stones. She was terrified. Her entire body trembled. Her heart felt ready to burst from her chest. She wanted to hide behind the others. She desperately wanted to retreat, but there was no room. The crowded cave had trapped her in the front row. She watched the tigers lower themselves. She watched them rush forward. In the past, that sight alone would have shattered all resistance. Every instinct in her blood screamed the same message: run. Run now! Yet her hand remained tightly wrapped around a fist-sized stone. In that moment, even she couldn't have explained what she was thinking. Perhaps she was simply too frightened to think clearly. Perhaps survival instinct was forcing her body to react. Whatever the reason, she suddenly opened her mouth and released a high-pitched roar. It sounded like a desperate attempt to encourage herself, like a declaration made at the edge of death. And somehow that cry awakened something inside her. She straightened her body completely. Her waist twisted to its limit. Her arm pulled back as far as it could go. It was the same movement she had accidentally learned earlier that day. Now, without conscious thought, she executed it perfectly. Her entire body became a fully drawn bow. The stone in her hand became the arrow. The next second, she released everything. Whoosh! The stone exploded forward with astonishing speed, cutting through the air with a sharp sound. The leading saber-toothed tiger was already less than 10 meters away. At that distance, there was no time to dodge. No time to react. For the first time in the history of their species, the descendants of humanity weren't running from a predator. They were fighting back. For the three saber-toothed tigers, what happened next was something they had never experienced in their entire lives. Since the day they were born, every battle in nature had followed the same rules. Whoever was stronger won. Whoever was faster survived. Whoever got close enough first became the hunter. Distance had never been a weapon. Yet now, the moment dozens of Ardipithecus raised their arms together, the world seemed to stop making sense. Whoosh! The first stone flew out. Then a second. Then a third. In the next instant, the entire cave erupted. Stones filled the air like a storm. They smashed into the cave walls, shattered against the ground, and whistled through the darkness from every direction. The three saber-toothed tigers had never seen anything like it. They didn't understand what was happening. They only knew that danger was suddenly coming from far away. A stone struck one tiger on the shoulder with a sharp crack. Another smashed against a foreleg. A third clipped an ear and sent it stumbling sideways with a startled roar. None of the individual impacts were fatal, but that wasn't the point. The terrifying thing was that they couldn't fight back. Every instinct they possessed told them to charge the enemy, to close the distance, to sink their fangs into flesh. But before they could even take a few steps forward, another wave of stones came crashing toward them. Bang! 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 The cave echoed with impacts. Dust filled the air. Sharp fragments bounced across the rocky floor. The tiger that had already been struck in the head earlier suffered the worst of it. Still dizzy from the first hit, it tried to stand and push forward, only to take another stone directly to the ribs. The impact forced a painful growl from its throat as it staggered backward again. Inside the cave, the Ardipithecus grew increasingly excited. At first, they had thrown out of fear. Now they were throwing with purpose. Every successful hit reinforced a simple idea. The monsters could be hurt. The monsters could be stopped. The monsters could be driven back. For generations beyond counting, every encounter with a saber-toothed tiger had ended the same way. Run, hide, prey. Today, for the first time, something different happened. The predators were retreating. The prey were advancing. One Ardipithecus let out a loud cry and stepped forward. Then another followed. Soon dozens of them were shouting together, clutching stones in both hands. Their voices echoed through the cave as more projectiles flew toward the entrance. The three saber-toothed tigers finally began to panic. Their excellent night vision allowed them to clearly see dozens of raised arms moving in unison. To them, it looked as though the apes had suddenly transformed into some strange new creature. A creature capable of striking from afar. A creature that didn't need claws or fangs to inflict pain. Another stone slammed into the ground between them. Another struck a shoulder. Another bounced off a skull. The predator's courage finally broke. One tiger stepped backward, then another. The third followed almost immediately. Within seconds, all three were retreating toward the cave entrance. The moment they turned around, the Ardipithecus became even more excited. More stones flew after them. The accuracy wasn't great. Most of the projectiles missed, but accuracy didn't matter anymore. The message had already been delivered. The tigers ran. The cave fell silent for a brief moment. Then the entire Ardipithecus group exploded into celebration. They jumped. They screamed. They waved their arms wildly. Some pounded their chests. Others grabbed more stones and held them tightly as if they had discovered the greatest treasure in existence. They didn't understand evolution. They didn't understand technology. They didn't understand strategy, but every one of them understood a single fact. The things that had always hunted them had just been driven away. And standing in the observation space, watching everything unfold, I slowly exhaled, because I knew the significance of what had just happened. The first ape stepping onto the ground had marked the birth of upright walking. The first ape gazing at the stars had marked the birth of curiosity. The first family had marked the birth of society. And now, inside a dark mountain cave, another milestone had appeared. The birth of force projection. The birth of ranged combat. The birth of the idea that danger could be eliminated before it ever reached you. To everyone else, it looked like a group of frightened apes throwing rocks. To me, it was the opening chapter of humanity's greatest weapon. Millions of years later, the descendants of these same creatures would throw spears, launch arrows, fire bullets, and eventually send missiles across continents. But all of those achievements trace their lineage back to this single moment. A terrified ape, a stone clenched in its hand, and the realization that distance itself could become power. The age of being hunted was beginning to end. The age of hunters who could kill without touching their prey had just begun. For the three saber-toothed tigers, it felt as if the sky itself had collapsed. The distance between both sides was already short, and the cave was incredibly narrow. On top of that, the stones were flying at terrifying speeds. In the blink of an eye, all three predators were being struck from every direction. The rocks were fast, heavy, and painfully powerful. Every impact sent sharp waves of pain through their bodies. Hits to the face, joints, and other vulnerable areas hurt even more. They rolled, they roared, they desperately tried to dodge. But the cave simply wasn't wide enough. The apes occupied the entire back section, and the stones kept coming in, wave after wave, without leaving a single blind spot. The experience was somehow even worse than being surrounded by wild hunting dogs. At least hunting dogs had to get close before attacking. These stones never did. They came flying from a distance, denying any chance of retaliation. The tigers possessed immense strength, incredible speed, and terrifying fangs, yet none of it mattered because they couldn't even reach their enemies. They could only endure the punishment. And so, the apex predators became afraid. Not metaphorically afraid, genuinely afraid. Every instinct inside them screamed the same message. Danger. Something is wrong with this cave. Something is wrong with these apes. Run. In nature, retreating from an unfavorable situation was completely normal. If something felt wrong, you left. If you couldn't win, you escaped. The only reason this felt so shocking was because saber-toothed tigers had never encountered a situation like this before. Normally, they only needed to charge. Their prey would immediately collapse into panic and flee. They never had to consider whether they might lose. But now the rules had changed. Two of the tigers could still stand. Their decision was immediate. They spun around and bolted toward the cave entrance, using their backs and shoulders to absorb as much damage as possible while protecting their heads. The third tiger wasn't so lucky. It had been the first one to charge and the first one hit by that devastating opening stone. Already dizzy, it had taken multiple additional impacts to its legs and body. It couldn't stand anymore. Curled on the cave floor, it became the focus of an even more concentrated barrage. Bang! 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 Its fur became matted and disheveled. Bruises and injuries covered its body. Repeated blows to the head left it barely conscious. Its vision darkened. Only when the apes finally ran out of suitable stones did the one-sided beating come to an end. The tiger wasn't dead immediately, but it was close. The enormous predator lay motionless on the ground, producing only weak, broken cries. Then the ape who had thrown the very first stone cautiously stepped forward. He poked his head out from the group and observed from a distance. Encouraged by the others behind him, he slowly approached. He looked left, then right. He carefully studied the predator. Finally, after confirming that the beast could no longer stand, he let out a loud call. The meaning was obvious. Safe. More apes immediately rushed forward. Among them was the largest and strongest male in the group. He dragged over a massive rock roughly the size of a basketball. Earlier that day, everyone had considered stones like this useless. They were too heavy to throw effectively, but now it served a completely different purpose. The large ape lifted the boulder above his head and smashed it down with all his strength. A dull, heavy impact echoed through the cave. The saber-toothed tiger's body twitched once, and then became completely still. The predator was dead. The cave immediately erupted into excited cries. Throughout their entire history, Ardipithecus had always been the hunted. Saber-toothed tigers killed them. Saber-toothed tigers terrified them. Never had they imagined that one day a tiger would lie helplessly before them while they surrounded it. Excitement quickly spread through the group. Then their attention shifted. Their eyes gradually settled upon the exposed flesh beneath the predator's torn hide. Meat. Many of them instinctively swallowed. At this stage of evolution, Ardipithecus primarily survived on fruits, nuts, roots, and the occasional insect. Protein was valuable, but obtaining large amounts of meat was nearly impossible for them. Yet now an entire saber-toothed tiger lay before them. The massive body represented an enormous supply of food. There was enough meat for everyone. Excitement slowly transformed into desire. Once again, the ape who had first thrown the stone found himself pushed toward the front. Ardipithecus didn't have kings. They didn't have chiefs. They didn't even have formal leadership. But during the life and death struggle that had just occurred, this ape had been the first to stand his ground, the first to strike their ancient enemy, the first to prove that predators could bleed, suffer, and fall. Because of that, the others instinctively trusted him, respected him. They wanted him to decide what came next. And he didn't disappoint. Walking directly to the tiger's corpse, he sat beside it and grabbed a section of exposed flesh. With a powerful tug, he ripped off a large chunk of red meat and stuffed it into his mouth. The taste was difficult to describe. Tough, bloody, hard to chew. Yet to him, it was more appealing than any fruit or insect he had ever eaten. His eyes immediately lit up. Excitedly, he called for the others to join him. And so that night, something extraordinary happened. The predator became the food. For the first time, Ardipithecus truly gained access to a large source of meat. Watching from above, I felt my gaze sharpen slightly, because I understood that what happened inside this cave wasn't merely a victory. It wasn't merely survival, it was another crucial step on the road toward humanity. First came upright walking, then curiosity, then family, then cooperation, then throwing. And now, for the first time, the descendants of those fragile tree-dwelling apes had earned a reliable source of high-energy animal protein through their own actions. They didn't realize it yet, but every bite they took was helping fuel larger brains, stronger bodies, and greater cognitive potential. Millions of years later, historians would never record the name of this ape. No one would remember this cave. Yet in my eyes, this moment was just as important as any battle fought by future civilizations. Because tonight, humanity's ancestors hadn't simply survived. For the first time, they had hunted the hunter. To me, it felt as though a new Pandora's box had just been opened. Meat wasn't simply food. It represented dense protein, fat, and concentrated energy. And all of those nutrients would continuously nourish something far more terrifying in the future, a larger brain. The moment Haibang Nation's viewers witnessed the scene, many of them nearly broke down. In their eyes, everything had become absurd. Not long ago, these apes would scatter in terror at the sound of a saber-toothed tiger's roar. Now they were tearing apart a tiger's hide and feasting on its flesh. It felt completely backwards. Their live stream instantly filled with angry comments. Meanwhile, Dragon Nation's viewers finally straightened their backs with pride. Huge numbers of them charged into Haibang Nation's stream to return every bit of mockery they had received earlier. But while ordinary viewers were overwhelmed by emotion, Haibang Nation's research team remained relatively calm. Some researchers suggested a possible solution. If Ardipithecus could unlock throwing through intervention, perhaps saber-toothed tigers could evolve something similar. The idea was quickly rejected. The reason was simple. Saber-toothed tigers couldn't even perform basic grasping motions with their paws. Forget holding objects, storing force, and throwing them. Their entire anatomy followed a completely different evolutionary path. Attempting to force such a change would likely cripple the very physical advantages that made them powerful in the first place. The cost far outweighed the benefits. In the end, the researchers could only comfort themselves with another conclusion. This disaster was mostly a result of the environment. The cave was narrow. The distance was short. The apes had numerical superiority. Stones were practically impossible to avoid under those conditions. If the battle had taken place on an open plain, the effectiveness of thrown rocks would be far lower. Landing a decisive hit on a healthy, mobile saber-toothed tiger would be significantly more difficult. Besides, more saber-toothed tigers were still migrating into the region. The pressure on Ardipithecus continued increasing. One victory didn't mean the overall situation had reversed. Soon, the heavenly screen advanced into a new stage. After experiencing meat for the first time, subtle changes began appearing within the Ardipithecus population. One dead tiger had provided enough food to last until the following day. But once that food was gone, hunger inevitably returned. They still needed to venture outside and search for more resources. Yet something was different now. The ape who had thrown the first stone had gradually become the leader of the group. He possessed qualities the others lacked: courage, initiative, decisiveness. As a result, the other apes naturally preferred following him and paying attention to his actions. And the emergence of a leader began transforming the group itself. What had once been little more than a collection of individuals gathered together for safety was slowly becoming something more organized, more unified, more purposeful. When the leader moved, others followed. When he investigated something, the others watched. When danger appeared, his reactions influenced the entire group's response. This wasn't true leadership as humans would understand it, but it was the beginning of hierarchy, the beginning of collective decision-making. And in my eyes, that development was just as important as throwing stones. Because civilization couldn't be built by isolated individuals. It required groups capable of acting together. The more I watched, the clearer the pattern became. Upright walking had freed the hands. Throwing had created distance-based combat. Meat had begun fueling brain development. Family structures had stabilized offspring survival. Now leadership was beginning to organize groups into larger social units. One piece after another, the foundation was being assembled. None of these changes looked particularly impressive on their own. In fact, compared to the giant mammoths, saber-toothed predators, and other powerful species dominating the version, Ardipithecus still appeared weak and insignificant. But that was exactly what everyone else failed to understand. Other species were investing in bigger teeth, bigger muscles, bigger bodies. Ardipithecus was investing in systems. Every improvement multiplied the value of every other improvement. Throwing made cooperation stronger. Cooperation made leadership more useful. Leadership improved resource gathering. Better nutrition accelerated brain development. Brain development enhanced every future adaptation. This wasn't linear growth. It was compounding growth. And that was why, no matter how many people mocked my choice, I never doubted it. Because while everyone else was staring at what existed in the present, I was looking at what these creatures would become. The others saw monkeys. I saw the first draft of humanity. And humanity had always been the most dangerous species of all. In the past, conflicts among the Ardipithecus usually broke out over food or territory. But now they were beginning to understand something new. When a real crisis arrived, someone had to step forward. Someone had to unite everyone together. Only then could the entire group survive. As a result, the population started becoming truly cohesive. This time, the leader gathered nearly 20 Ardipithecus and prepared to leave the cave together in search of food. They were no longer just a few scattered apes traveling side by side. This was a genuine group expedition. By noon, when the sun was at its harshest, the troop emerged from the cave. More than 20 individuals moved together, creating an impressive sight. Even nearby animals reacted differently. Solitary predators that normally wouldn't hesitate to attack a lone ape now stopped and watched from a distance. They no longer approached carelessly. The Ardipithecus themselves could feel the difference. Having companions was reassuring. Unlike before, they no longer traveled in constant fear that something might suddenly leap from the bushes and drag one of them away. 20 pairs of eyes meant 20 lookouts. Their sense of security increased dramatically. Today's destination was a fruit grove located beyond the mountains. To reach it, they needed to cross a small stretch of open plain, a journey of roughly 3 kilometers. The grove contained a species of hard-shelled fruit that the apes loved, and the trees were currently full of ripe produce. Before leaving, the leader bent down and picked up a stone of suitable size. He examined it carefully and seemed satisfied. Then he began encouraging the others to do the same. They had already witnessed the power of stones firsthand. These weren't toys anymore. They were survival tools. Although they couldn't carry many due to limited hand space, bringing a few would at least help discourage predators. Just as they were preparing to leave, however, the leader's attention was drawn to something else. Near the roots of a tree lay a broken branch over a meter long and roughly as thick as a wrist. It had probably fallen after being snapped by some tree-dwelling animal. The leader stared at it for a long time. Eventually, after his companions began urging him to move, he bent down and picked it up. Holding it experimentally, he gave it a few test swings. Whoosh! The branch sliced through the air with a noticeable sound. Immediately, his eyes lit up. Thanks to the physical modifications I had introduced, Ardipithecus hadn't only unlocked throwing. They had also gained wider shoulder mobility and stronger rotational power through the waist. In practical terms, this meant they could swing objects with far more force than before. A simple wooden club could now generate astonishing impact when wielded properly. Of course, the apes understood none of the mechanics behind it. All they knew was that the stick felt powerful, useful, exciting. And so, like every curious creature before them, they instantly began searching for more. Soon the surrounding area was thoroughly scavenged. Out of the 20-plus apes, more than a dozen found suitable clubs. Those who couldn't find branches carried stones instead. Thus, a truly strange sight appeared on the prehistoric landscape. A group of upright walking apes marched out of the forest. One hand held a club, the other gripped a stone. Inside Dragon Nation's livestream, many viewers couldn't stop laughing. Some joked that they could no longer look at these apes normally because they reminded them of childhood memories, running around villages with sticks and pretending to fight imaginary enemies. Others pointed out that nobody could resist picking up a good-looking stick and swinging it around a few times. The jokes kept coming, but beneath the humor, something else was happening. More and more viewers were beginning to realize that these Ardipithecus truly were different. They remained weak. They were still nowhere near the strongest species in the version. Yet a strange sense of potential was beginning to emerge, a feeling that they could actually accomplish something. Meanwhile, changes within the ecosystem were becoming increasingly obvious. Because Hai Bang Nation had artificially concentrated huge numbers of saber-toothed tigers in the same region, Large animals were becoming noticeably rarer. Some had been hunted, others had fled. The plains were slowly transforming into a paradise for predators. Naturally, the Ardipithecus understood none of this. Yet the moment they stepped onto the grasslands, they immediately attracted attention. 3 or 4 saber-toothed tigers spotted the troop from different directions. However, the situation was no longer the same as before. 20-plus apes moving together represented a scale these predators had rarely encountered. More importantly, while Haibang Nation's intervention had gathered saber-toothed tigers into one area, it hadn't magically turned them into cooperative pack hunters. Deep down, they still viewed themselves as solitary predators. At best, they tolerated the presence of nearby members of their species. Coordinated hunting simply wasn't part of their instincts. As a result, none of the tigers attacked immediately. Instead, they relied on the methods they knew best. They watched from afar, they followed quietly, they waited for an opportunity. A straggler, a wounded individual, someone separated from the group, then they would strike. Following this strategy, the predators shadowed the Ardipithecus all the way to the fruit grove. Even after the apes entered the grove, the tigers continued waiting. The dense environment wasn't ideal for an ambush. Charging in recklessly could expose them and ruin the hunt. Back in Haibang Nation's research headquarters, the lead researcher was becoming increasingly frustrated. He practically wished he could jump into the heavenly screen himself and teach the tigers how to hunt properly. But instinct wasn't destiny. The saber-toothed tigers could only act according to their nature. Eventually, 2 of them lost patience. They spotted an easier target elsewhere, a Samotherium. The large herbivore offered far more meat than an ape and carried significantly less risk. Without hesitation, they abandoned the troop and moved on. Only 2 saber-toothed tigers remained outside the grove, continuing their silent vigil. Hidden among the shadows, they waited for weakness, waited for mistakes, waited for an opportunity. And inside the fruit grove, completely unaware of the danger still watching them, the Ardipithecus were about to take another step forward on the path that would one day reshape the entire world. About half an hour later, after filling their stomachs and stuffing their arms with fruit, the Ardipithecus began the journey back. Nothing had happened on the way to the grove, and that inevitably caused their vigilance to relax. Their formation loosened. The group was no longer as tightly organized as before. The 2 saber-toothed tigers that had been waiting patiently knew this was the moment they had been hoping for. One of them was already starving. It had no interest in waiting any longer and launched its attack immediately. The second tiger was more patient by nature, but the moment its companion moved, its own position was exposed. It had no choice but to charge as well. Suddenly, the quiet grassland exploded with the thunder of pounding footsteps. The oppressive aura of apex predators descended instantly. The first tiger moved with terrifying speed. A single leap was enough to knock one of the Ardipithecus flat onto the ground. Its massive paw came crashing down, inflicting a devastating injury. The wounded ape let out a piercing scream. Haibang Nation's livestream erupted in celebration. Dragon Nation's viewers felt their hearts leap into their throats. But before the cheering could continue for long, a stone came flying through the air. Smack! It slammed directly into the tiger's body. The predator froze. There wasn't a single enemy within 2 meters of it. Under normal circumstances, anything entering that range would immediately be detected and dealt with. The prey was already pinned beneath its paws. By every rule of nature, it should have been completely safe. Then, why had it been attacked? The tiger's simple mind couldn't comprehend it. Before it could process what happened, more stones came flying in. The hunt was forcibly interrupted. The tiger swung its head left and right in panic. It could feel pain, but it couldn't identify the source. The sensation was horrifying. It felt as though invisible enemies were attacking from every direction. If it remained where it was, something even worse might happen. Without hesitation, it abandoned the prey beneath its paws and retreated. The surrounding Ardipithecus immediately rushed forward, dragging their injured companion back into the center of the group. Watching this unfold, the head researcher of Haibang Nation nearly lost his mind. It was right there, he wanted to scream. Just finish the kill and drag it away. But that reaction perfectly highlighted the difference between humans and predators. Humans thought in terms of maximizing gains. Wild animals thought in terms of survival. The moment a tiger encountered a threat it couldn't understand, instinct demanded retreat. That was the safest option. Of course, the situation also revealed another important fact. In open terrain, stones alone still struggled to kill a healthy saber-toothed tiger. Unless a vital area was struck immediately, the predator could usually escape. But the crucial point was this. Escaping meant the Ardipithecus had already won. The second tiger had chosen a different target. Its eyes were fixed on the troop leader. Unfortunately for it, the first tiger's attack had already alerted the group. The element of surprise was gone. The leader noticed the danger instantly and hurled the only stone in his hand. This tiger happened to be lucky. or perhaps simply quick enough. At the last second, it leaped sideways, narrowly avoiding a direct hit to the face. Yet that evasive movement disrupted its attack rhythm. Its momentum faltered for just a fraction of a second, and that tiny pause was all the leader needed. Gripping the 1-meter wooden club with both hands, he unleashed a powerful horizontal swing. Thud! The impact landed squarely on the tiger's body. The predator was stunned. It couldn't understand what had just happened. Why did this ape suddenly possess something so long, so hard, so fast? The sensation that traveled through its body felt as though it had been struck by a charging large animal. The pain was immediate and confusing. But what truly unsettled the tiger wasn't the blow itself. It was the leader's reaction afterward. Instead of retreating in fear, the ape roared and advanced. Again and again, he swung the club through the air. Whoosh! 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 The branch cut through the wind so rapidly it almost left after images. Combined with the leader's aggressive posture, the effect was remarkable. A dangerous zone formed around him, a radius that the tiger instinctively didn't want to enter. Every time the predator stepped back, the leader stepped forward. The tiger retreated again. The leader continued pressing the attack. Then more Ardipithecus arrived, carrying stones and clubs of their own. At that point, the tiger finally abandoned the idea of hunting altogether. It turned and fled. Even as it ran, the side of its face throbbed painfully from the earlier strike. Yet what troubled it most wasn't the pain. It was confusion. It simply couldn't understand what had happened. The only thing it remembered clearly was that strange object, that long thing, that hard thing, that thing that moved far too fast. Watching the scene unfold, I couldn't help but focus on the club in the leader's hands. Because another line had just been crossed. The stone represented the first projectile weapon. The club represented something equally important. The first external force multiplier. Until now, every creature on Earth had fought using what nature gave them: claws, teeth, horns, muscles. But the leader wasn't fighting with his body anymore. He was fighting with an object that extended his reach, increased his power, changed the outcome of battle. It was still crude, primitive, barely more than a broken branch. Yet the principle behind it was revolutionary. Millions of years later, humanity would create spears, axes, swords, and countless other tools. But every one of them traced their origin back to a simple realization. Sometimes the strongest weapon wasn't part of your body at all. Sometimes the strongest weapon was the thing you picked up and decided to use. And once a species learned that lesson, the entire world became its arsenal.